Okay, just from my perspective, I've been involved in a number of large development opportunities. I have to say that I think pretty much all of them have presented a significant number of challenges. And John, I'm sorry to say, I'm sure Airport City will probably be no different, but it has got great credentials, so I'm sure we'll work through them. As far as I'm concerned, it's a great opportunity for economic growth in the city region. I mean, I've been working in the property sector for a number of years now, and I look at what's going on in the property market, and I think something like Airport City is fantastic to have in the Manchester area, and I think it's a great and much-needed fillet, given how London is increasingly dominating the economic agenda. So I think it's fantastic for the region. What I'm going to spend, I'm not going to mention any law. You'll be glad to hear, probably because I don't know any anymore, but what I'm going to do is just spend a few moments looking at some of the issues and challenges that I think we face bringing forward large development sites of this nature, and then just offer a few thoughts on how we might address them. Unfortunately, I think the economic circumstances we're in means that there are some challenges. The government's introduced a whole new agenda of localism and local enterprise partnerships, and I'm not sure anyone really knows how it's all going to pan out, but I think there are some positive opportunities, and I'll look at those in a minute. First of all, just a bit of background. I like a bit of economic history. Those who know me will appreciate that. I really just want to set the scene. Prior to the financial crisis of 2008, we had a decade or so of massive government spending. To my mind, that was epitomised by the private finance initiative. There's a huge number of new projects. It'd be very interesting to see where PFI goes. My bet is that we will see some form of off-balance sheet mechanism for the provision of capital assets, so I don't think it's dead. In that decade or so of growth, we saw massive GDP growth rates. I mean, it's very interesting that annual growth rates were often up at 3.5, 3.6%. And if you look historically at growth rates for the UK, the USA, France and Germany in the post-war period, for decades they were probably around 1.7 to 2.1%. So it really was a very unusual period. Growth was largely driven by the public sector and by consumers, and I have to say, sadly, substantially based upon borrowed money, which is one of the reasons why I think we face some significant challenges now. And we also saw, of course, which is something very dear to my heart, the build-up of a huge real estate bubble and a substantial increase in bank lending into that sector. So it was all great, and I remember Gordon Brown saying he'd abolish boom and bust, and it was all going to be fine. We then moved on and into 2008, I think it was October 2008, and we saw the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the near financial meltdown that followed. And we now find ourselves in a very, very, very different economic environment, which I think creates some interesting challenges for bringing forward any scheme, let alone a large scheme. Anyone who's involved in the market will know that funding is very hard to secure. I also think personally that what I call the abject lack of policy cohesion in the Eurozone and the unfolding sovereign debt crisis is actually going to make matters worse over the next 12 months, which isn't going to help the banking sector. Currently, the banking sector has an exposure to commercial property of around 207 billion, and I understand that roughly 20% of that is in default, and more than half is due to be refinanced in the next 3 years. So I think you can sort of gauge from that there's some real issues in terms of how you drive these projects forward, and the key drivers are obviously finance and occupier demand, and I'll touch on those in a minute. We've also got a situation where speculative development, I mean, it's not entirely dead, but it's very, very difficult to contemplate speculative development at the moment, unless you happen to be in London, which we're not. Occupier demand is scarce. For any scheme like this, I think you need some decent occupiers. You need something to kickstart the first phase. I do think the proximity of the hospital and the airport will help there in attracting those big users, but that's key. And I think the other issue, I mean, I think a lot of the land is probably already owned, which helps, but property values outside London generally make development a real challenge. So it's a very difficult environment, I think. However, I think, given where we are in the economic cycle, I think things will inevitably improve as the economic cycle runs its course. As John says, it is a 10, 15-year project, so, and it's a great project as well. So what I'm going to do now is just look at, where do we go from here? On the funding side, I firmly believe we need to look at other structures to complement or replace traditional bank funding and, of course, public sector prudential borrowing, basically because the cash just isn't there from those sources. And I think this task of finding alternative funding has tentatively started, but it's still at a very early stage. The government's introduced the local government resource review, which is designed to incentivise local authorities to drive growth. And basically, as John's referred to, the review is aimed at allowing local authorities to benefit financially from decisions which lead to additional growth in their area. So I think that's very definitely pointing in the right direction. Within enterprise zones, as we've already mentioned, business rate growth will be retained and shared by the local authorities within the local enterprise area. I think it's almost inevitable that we're going to see tax increment financing coming on board, and I suspect they'll be introduced in the enterprise zones first and foremost, and that does require primary legislation from Parliament, so unfortunately that's, I suspect, 1 or 2 years off. But basically what that allows local authorities to do is to actually borrow against future increases in business rates, which we call the increment, and I think that ability to borrow against future income is going to be key in bringing forward some of these larger projects. I think it's also going to result in the development of a municipal bond market similar to that has operated for a number of years in the USA. So I think there's some really interesting ideas around sort of muni bonds and financing larger projects going forward. We've also got the 3-year 1.4 billion regional growth fund, and I know Felicity's involved in that. I mean, that's great, but it goes without saying it doesn't replace the money that was available through the RDAs. So there is a big funding gap there. I think the community infrastructure levy is a very interesting idea. To my knowledge, I don't think that's really taken off yet. The number of authorities have introduced it. I think it's still relatively small. But the idea is that it's a new levy that local authorities can elect to charge in order to support the funding of infrastructure in their neighbourhood. There is an overlap with Section 106, but I think that's largely been worked through. Now, the trick, of course, is to set the levy at a rate that doesn't put off developers, but actually generates enough cash to provide the key infrastructure that's required for any large project of this nature. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's probably not been used as much as we'd like so far, because that, the difficulty of setting that levy it's a difficult choice. And then we've also got some more esoteric forms of funding. There's a lot of talk in the markets about things such as social impact bonds. They're very much in their infancy, but in essence a development or a partner body would be paid out against future improvements in pre-agreed social outcomes, the obvious one being a reduction in unemployment. And the idea being that the local authority, or DWP in this case, would be able to pay out the development partner against a reduced future spend on unemployment benefit. And I do think we're in a period where we do need some innovative and interesting ideas to fund some of these schemes or part fund them, because the banks are only lending whatever 55-65%. So yeah, they are important. I think it's also interesting because I think it's going to be very appealing to the third sector and to social enterprises. And everyone who's familiar with the localism agenda, everyone's aware that the third sector is going to take an increasingly important role in some of these initiatives. And I'm sure on schemes such as this, they'll be broken down into phases, and there'll be opportunities to roll out different elements of funding for different phases, etc. So I think all that's, the thought process is being driven forward, and that's all very positive. I think we're also going to see new ways of working. The local enterprise partnerships, of course, have been formed, and I think Manchester's is up and running. I think it's chaired by Mike Blackburn. This always makes me laugh. Apparently LEPs are based on real economic geographies instead of false administrative boundaries, so make of that what you want, but there we go. I'm sure there'll be a great success. To be fair, they're actually designed to foster collaboration between local authorities and the private sector, and they're tasked with providing private sector strategic leadership so that key economic decisions are made which actually drive growth and improve the local community. I think the idea is great. I think they've certainly got their work cut out in terms of transferring the theory into practice. I think we're going to see a more strategic use of public assets in conjunction with the private sector, particularly those based around education and health. The the work that Felicity is doing at the University Hospital of South Manchester, I think I've got that right.
Very well said.
Excellent, is involving the development of their surplus land, and looking at Mediparks is going to be key there. And I think if you throw, you know, those assets and those development opportunities into the mix, I think you've got a real opportunity to stimulate and encourage growth. I think we're going to see some interesting ideas developing around capital projects based on the concept of total assets and community budgets. Now, if that policy really takes off, which I believe it will, I think you're going to see the pooling of resources from various public sector organisations, for example, in the health sector, education, police, fire service, etc. And the pooling of services and resources will actually, I think, go some way to helping to sort of create value and stimulating development and kick-starting development. It also links in, of course, with one of the government's main initiatives around the public estate, where there's a whole rationalisation of the public estate, and the government's looking to use the public estate more efficiently. So I think that'll help. I think we're also going to see the continued evolution of joint venture structures. It's almost inconceivable that there's not going to be a large element of joint venturing in these larger projects these days. I mean, the economic circumstances and the lack of funding mean that is inevitable. There's been a lot of talk over the last year or two about local asset-backed vehicles and co-ownership vehicles, and I'm sure we'll see further developments around those themes. And the local asset-backed vehicles are really development vehicles where the local authority and a private development partner put in money and land, and the private development partner then develops land out in phases in accordance with an agreed master plan. I think that's going to be really helpful. And co-ownership vehicles, and I think this is a great idea, they're basically a situation where the local authority's got some land, private sector partner comes in and puts some money in, and that allows the land to be provided with infrastructure. The local authority then effectively sells service plots. So it's an alternative and slightly less involved means of joint venturing, and I think there's a lot of mileage in that, particularly on a large scheme such as this, where you might have sort of bespoke phases where, you know, you may just want to effectively get shot, so you put some infrastructure in and then divvy up the increase in land value at the end. I mentioned earlier PFI. I'm absolutely positive we're going to see the return of off-balance sheet funding for capital assets. I do think there'll be a very different risk-reward matrix, though, from that seen in PFI, which has received quite a lot of adverse publicity, even though it was tremendously successful in bringing forward a large number of capital projects, which has undoubtedly been good news. And I think we're also going to see a lot more equity participation from the public sector, from local authorities. There's going to be a lot more risk-taking. Interestingly, Pickles in the localism bills introduced this new and much touted general power of competence. I'm not entirely convinced it was actually necessary, but it sounds great, and I think there's a real push for, you know, the public sector to get stuck in and take some risk and really drive some of these projects forward. Just very briefly, some final thoughts. Upfront infrastructure costs are a key issue in any big development like this. How that's going to be funded, I think, is a really interesting question. You know, we've mentioned community infrastructure levy. The government's definitely committed to spending on infrastructure. It realises that it's key to creating growth for the future, and they've already committed 200 million to this Ordsall Cord, which is going to link Manchester Victoria to Manchester Piccadilly. So I think we'll see more coming out of that. The other key thing is attracting occupier demand. The market's very flat at the moment, and I think inward investment from both within the UK and critically, I think, also from abroad is going to be crucial. Undoubtedly, the status of the airport is going to help there, as will the efforts of partner organisations such as IDAS. And Tim's obviously heavily involved in that, which is great news. I think it's already been mentioned, but we need to capitalise on the region's knowledge economy and our reputation for excellent higher education. At the end of the day, a skilled workforce is key, and I do think we've got that in abundance in Manchester. So, you know, I think that's a real pull. And I also think, I was chatting to John about this a few weeks ago, I think we're probably going to see, particularly if the economic environment continues as it is, the evolution of incentives for the enterprise zones. And it may well be that we'll see capital allowances for buildings to a limited extent, as well as for plant and machinery, which is already factored in. So I think that'll be good. And personal sort of issue for me, I think we've got to attract advanced manufacturing to areas like Airport City. I think that's a key part of the success, not just for this region but for UK PLC. I think there's been far too much emphasis over the years on professional and financial services, and I think in conjunction with the hospitals and the Mediparks, we need to get the advanced manufacturing sector up and running and creating jobs. There's a lot of debate about whether manufacturing in the high-tech sector can provide enough employment to meet future demand. I suspect it can't, but I think we're going to have to put it in the mix and really push it. And I suspect if Margaret Thatcher was here today, one of the things that she would regret is not giving as much effort to advanced manufacturing as she did to financial services, because she basically liberalised financial services, and unfortunately the upshot was that the opportunities we had in abundance for high-tech manufacturing in the UK have really been rather left behind. So I think that's a key. So it's not a difficult task, John. There's not much to sort out.
Lots of options.
Lots of options, yeah, absolutely. And the final thing from me is that I do think we live in a truly global economy now, and if we're going to compete as a not just a city region but as a northwest region, we've got to think globally. And I can't think of a better example or opportunity than Airport City. It's a great asset, and I think it will allow us to compete on the global stage. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen.